Hello, everyone. I don't really need the mic, I guess. My name is Ruchir Shah. I'm the incoming president of the Baker Institute Student Forum. I'm hoping you're excited for a really exciting and interesting event. In the wake of the recent earthquake in Haiti, there's been a lot of discussion about exactly how we can help the development across the globe. For example, in Haiti, the 7.0 magnitude earthquake, there were over 200,000 deaths. Versus Chile, it was an 8.8 magnitude earthquake, and there were less than 1,000 deaths. So there's a huge discrepancy because of an undeveloped country, one of the poorest in the world. So hopefully today our speaker will talk a little bit about Haiti, but also more about the broader struggle for development. So this event was made possible through the support of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, ISI, and with the generous support of the Herstein Foundation. ISI is a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving the quality of college education and providing resources necessary to complete education. They've helped us in the past with an event with Tim Carney, which some of you might have attended, which was really incredible, and they've been really helpful. So thank you very much to ISI. They have a booth set up outside, and if you fill out the cards that will be passed around, you can win some free books. So it's really exciting. Please see Michelle Huntley after the lecture for any questions. So today's speaker is an associate professor of economics at the Catholic University of America. Dr. Sophia Aguirre is a specialist in international finance and economic development in the areas of exchange rates and economic integration, as well as theories of population, resources, and family. In the past, she has testified before lawmakers in the United States and abroad. A presidential appointee to the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy, Aguirre has also held appointments at the University of Chicago and Northwestern University, and has visited the Instituto de Altos Estudios Empresariales at the University of Austral in Argentina. She earned her undergraduate degree, CPA and MBA in Argentina, and her Ph.D. in economics from the University of Notre Dame. We have a pretty small group here, but I think it'll be a really exciting opportunity to hear Dr. Aguirre speak and hopefully have her answer any questions you may have. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sophia Aguirre. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you for being here. Thank you. I want to take advantage to thank the Institute for Public Policy as well as ISI for your invitation. And the topic of today is family well-being and poverty eradication. As I go along presenting the broader picture of this connection between family well-being and poverty eradication, I will be addressing some of points of Haiti. If it works. Okay. So what do we know about sustainable economic growth? I mean, as economists, and not only economists, everybody, I suppose, what we want is sustainable economic growth, right? Something that will last and that will meet the needs of people. Mainstream economics really have been searching for the way to get that done, right? And what we know is today that technical solutions are not sufficient, right? That we need institutions. It's not enough to have the best policies. And I like to put as an example the country where my parents come from, Argentina, country that has many resources. It has it all, and yet has nothing, right? Because of the poor, good policies, bad institutions. We learned that lesson. I think it's enough to look at Latin America, Sub-Sahara, et cetera, to realize that it's not enough to have good policies. You need good institutions. And we need to develop and maintain those institutions. And the question becomes, how do we go about it? What are the elements that are relevant for that? And what I will try to show you today is that an important factor within the production of those institutions is the family, and not only for the institutions, but also for economics, for the means that we need for investment. These have led mainstream economics to reevaluate, right? How do we go about thinking economics? Is enough to open the economy, or we need other things besides opening the economy? It also is shown in the way we have begin to monitor how a country is doing. Before, we used to look at inflation. We used to look at how is the monetary policy going, how are we doing with inflation, how are we doing with GDPs, et cetera. Now we look at other things, right? We look at factors of quality of life. Mm-hmm. development, the people potential, education, etc. So it's not just we learned the lesson, index of economic freedom, etc. So is the family relevant for economic development and poverty eradication? And I would say that you will get two types of answers to this question. The first one is yes, because Earth is limited and resources are not infinite. Besides, we have small spaces. Second, you will hear that the family is hostile place for women and children. And third, that large families threaten countries' stabilities. On the other side, you're going to get the following answer. Healthy families are needed for the economic to fulfill its purpose. And I would say in this context, that is very important for investment and savings. Growth of population does not equal poverty, and there is plenty of empirical evidence for that. And the aging population trap threatens sustainable economic growth, and we can look at the situation of Europe, China, etc. So what do we need for sustainable economic growth? What does empirical evidence tell us what we need? Well, we need institutions, we need savings, because if not, you don't have investment. You need wealth. You need investment, and when I talk about investment, it's not only physical investment, but also human investment as well. Remittances, I have a question mark on that one, and the reason why I bring up Haiti, I have to remember almost 80% of the GDP of Haiti is remittances, right? Is a huge amount. And so is that really a solution? And I will at least put a question mark on that based on the research I've done myself. And then we need good policies. We know for analysis that in economic development, what are the causalities that we know? Okay, we know that there is a positive correlation, and I want to emphasize this point. Positive correlation doesn't indicate causality, right? Only tells me that two variables move together or they are inversely related, but doesn't tell me that A causes B whatsoever. What we know is that there is a positive correlation between human capital infrastructure and economic growth, health institutions and economic development, health and income per capita. If we think in Haiti again, health, long way to go. 80% of the population is under poverty. Healthy institutions, corruption is one of the highest levels in the country, in the world. Not surprisingly, is at the bottom of, it's the poorest country in America. And health and income per capita also is connected. And this, I want to emphasize this point because it's connected to wealth as well. We know also that there is essential causality, and now, yes, we are talking about causality between human capital and healthy institutions, and more specifically, I'm thinking of social capital, and infrastructure and technology also is connected to human capital. Not by accident, you have countries that whose conversions is much faster where there is a higher level of education, and we can think on the case of the newly industrialized countries back in the late 80s and 90s. We can think of Central Europe. Life expectancy is a significant predictor of economic growth. Also, empirical evidence show us that all in all, and it's not in every country, but the neoclassical model seems to be the one that explains best the process of economic growth across countries, not only developed countries, but also developing countries. And when I say best, I'm talking about 1990s or mid-1980s on. Before, I guess that we need to have a further discussion. But what I'm just not going to bore you with the whole theory. Just for curiosity, how many economists in the room? So I know how technical can I get? None. Okay. Oh, one, two. Okay. So I have to be careful now. But what we know is that an essential element of growth in this neoclassical theory is investment, right? We need investment as an engine of growth. Now, how does the family fit in the economy? And this is what I would like to propose. You have three basic activities in economics: production, exchange, consumption. What is the purpose? We need to meet basic needs. We need profits if we need to grow, and we need well-being, welfare and well-being. The role of the family, I would suggest, that is important in the production level because of human capital and wealth, savings for investment, is important for human, moral, and social capital for exchange. I mean, why is it that in countries that there is not really solid institutions, transparency, corruption, rule of law, etc., it's so difficult to maintain any market, right? Well, because you need those basic things to exchange. And then consumption, well, you know other things too, but here I'm talking about the family. Consumption, you need appropriate distribution. And I would say that it's in here where perhaps the role of the women is especially noticeable within the economy. The one who knows within the family what the children need, typically is the women, right? Socioeconomic relevance. Why is family relevant from a human capital, social capital, and moral capital point of view? Well, science across the board show that children develop best within families that are functional, right? And what I mean with that is a mother and father in a stable relationship. We know that marriage increases likelihood of fathers having good relations with children, and we know that's very important for the stability of the children, especially women. Marriage reduces the probability of children divorcing themselves or becoming unwanted parents, and we know this is a serious, it has a serious impact in the stability of the child or the adolescent and actually the adults as well. And not only that, but it is important, and I will show you some numbers for wealth. The academic and social performance of children is very closely related to the structure of the family, and this is important for human and social capital. Well, in every front, they do better in health, better performance academically, sharply reduce infant mortality, and remember that infant mortality or life expectancy is a good predictor of economic growth. Increases associated with reduced to abuse of alcohol, substance abuse, and we know the consequences, especially in Texas, of having drugs, etc., around the borders, associated with better health and lower probability of injuries, less psychological distress and mental illness. And all these things, and not only for the well-being of the person, but remember that this poses weight on the finances of a country. This is the percentage of family, women, and children who are in poverty by family structure as ethnicity. This is a 2009 August report, data of 2008 for the United States. In here, by no means I'm showing you causality, but I think it gives us clearly of what's happening. Here you have white, Asian, and Pacific, Black, Hispanic. Roughly speaking, as you know, white, educated, middle, average income or better, and certainly legal. Asian and Pacific, immigrants, typically well-educated. Blacks, we have serious problems of poverty among that population, and Hispanics, we are not even legal, right? So in spite of that, look the difference between percentage of families, children, women, normally they go together. As you see, it goes in crescendo and worse because the children stay with the women is in poverty, and so it gets only worse. Married versus single, right? And these are single parents, by the way. They're not just single parents. So clearly, and this is very basic data, right? I will show you more empirical causality involved here, but what this tells us is, roughly speaking, no matter what the level of education is, legal or not legal, family structure is important for wealth and for poverty, therefore. The current status of the family, what in developing countries specifically, what do we know is that often they do not have human assets, they don't have natural assets, they don't have access to physical assets, financial assets, social assets, and aging security. Most of these families in developing countries don't have social security to speak about, right? And in aging population countries, they have it in theory. They cannot sustain it. So that needless to say, that makes families, especially in developing countries, very vulnerable to any type of adverse shock. Look at Haiti. Right? What I have here It's a comparison of average. It's an average comparison between developing countries versus developed countries on some things. Connection to water, 89 to 99, so not that bad. Sewage system, 63 to 99. Electricity, typical, something that we often find in developing countries, and again, Haiti is not an exception. There is an abysmal difference between rural and urban, right? 50 to 62 in developing countries, but in some countries that if you see the data, it might be 20 to 70 or something like that. There is definitely a big abysmal difference between the access to water, to electricity, etc. Access to improved water, 92 to 63% versus 100%, and actually those two numbers are inverse. Medicine, that's something that we have improved quite a bit in the 90s and 2000. Again, roughly speaking, generalities, there are exceptions confirm the rule, but in general, across the board, basic medicine is more accessible in developing countries than used to be. Immunization, that's another area that we have improved a lot. Infant mortality, however, is still high compared to developed countries. Public health expenditures, 2.3 of GDP versus 6.2 in developed countries. Access to roads and paved roads. If I were to include China, and I on purpose took China away, because that number will become close to 20%, 25% if I include China in that number. So we're talking about if you don't have roads, you don't have markets. You need to move your goods from one place to another. This is basics, right? And if you don't have roads, for sure, you don't have an airport either. So, except for drugs. Phone lines, cellular subscriptions clearly is catching up. And then we have the literacy. And again, that literacy is inflated by Latin America. If I were to take Latin America away, that number will be significantly lower in developing countries. Now, what do people die of? Maternal conditions is less than, is 1.9 or something like that, no, 1.8 or something like that, or maybe less, 1.3, I will show you in a minute. Perinatal conditions, malaria, tuberculosis, injuries, AIDS. And we go down. Most of the people die of a heart attack, and if they don't know what they die of, typically the heart stops, so that's how the statistic goes, and that's why it's so big. One time I asked the doctor, I don't know much about medicine, I learned all my years, but he told me, Sophia, the reason why you have those numbers always so big is because that's the one that you always know, the heart stop. What I'm trying to a couple of things I want to point out here because are important for the case of Haiti and certainly for the case of all the developing sub-Saharan countries especially and some of the Asian countries. Malaria and tuberculosis, right, and HIV are on the top. But let me notice that here in the order of things, right, HIV is not the first one, okay? And typically, when we talk about health and the needs of people, the only thing we hear is HIV. Right? Well, let me put some perspective of that. First of all, HIV new cases are 2.7 million versus 9.9 tuberculosis and 300 to 500 million, depending on how bad was the rainy season of malaria. And why do I put this emphasis? Because when it comes to these things, I'm very materialistic. Right? Where do the funds go? And are we really meeting the needs of sustainable development? Keep that in mind and let's go to the next thing. Now, percentage fully immunized of what we see is a clear decline from Central Eastern Europe to Sub-Sahara. As you see, Latin America is not as bad as Sub-Sahara for both tuberculosis and measles. So 20% decrease in tuberculosis, 33% decrease in measles. When we go to life expectancy, OECD countries versus Sub-Sahara, we are talking about 30 years. And remember that that is a good predictor of economic growth. 95% decrease in infant mortality when we talked about Sub-Sahara versus OECD countries. What does it cost us? Well, for tuberculosis, those numbers are basically the cost for the treatment and the effectiveness rate. including per capita, would be the 0.6 between parentheses. So it cost me $20 the treatment, 60 cents per capita. And if you know anything about public health, that's the number we are interested in. The last one, the bottom one. Contraceptive, $14, cost me 1.9. Not cost effective if you compare to tuberculosis, and remember, it's much higher the number. Diarrhea, leading cause of death for children, 1.6. Measles, 26.50. Malaria, this is really the one who really normally gets to me, is 5 cents. Right? Now, what do we solve with 5 cents? What we know about cost of malaria, it costs us about 1.3% of the GDP per year. The productivity of the worker reduced 60%. How much money we put in malaria? Africa, in terms of GDP, is equivalent. The cost in malaria is estimated to be 100 billion annually, and this is only to sub-Saharan Africa, where most of the poorest countries are. How much we invest on it? Remember, 60% of productivity, 1.3% of the GDP, $1.4 billion. That being said, that's significantly higher than what has been in previous years. I mean, in the last 5 years, we have increased investment in malaria quite a bit, finally. And the reduction has been more than 50%. So actually, those pills that cost us only 50 cents seems to be doing the job. TB, 75% of TB infections and deaths occurs between 15 and 54 years old, and that is our labor force. In countries that are already poor, we need that labor force. 20 to 13% income is lost due to TB. And how much money do we put on? 4.2. How many people get? Between $300 and $500 million, 7 million people a year. 8th, 7th among the leading causes of death. Funding for only 2 years, $9.5 billion. From a public health point of view, it's difficult to justify. Majority of maternal death, which typically is used as one of the excuses, I was telling you the number, 1.9% of female death, is normally accessed not because of maternity, but because of poor access to health care, especially in developing countries and poor countries. So the relevance of family structure as an aspect of development, as I was saying before, sustainable growth for poverty reduction requires wealth, savings, and investment. And the family, as I'm going to show you in the rest of the presentation, is very important for these things. What I chose to do today, and with this, this is the last section I'm going to present in terms of data. I decided to make a study comparing 4 countries in America. USA, the reason for that was developed country market economy. Canada, developed country social market economy. Guatemala, 60% of the population is in poverty. The average of education is not 3rd grade, it's 2.6 or something like that. And proportionally, and that's why I picked up Guatemala, proportionally, because Mexico is the largest in Latin America, but proportionally is the largest country receiving remittances. When I say proportion, it's vis-a-vis the GDP and the balance of trade. And then I chose Chile, not because I knew it was going to have an earthquake and it's right on time, but because it's a successful developing story. Chile have managed to really maintain consistency of policies on growth, attract foreign investment, etc. So it's a successful story. So what I'm going to show you here are the graphs, but this reflects the econometric treatment and causality that I'm going to refer to. This is the household income net wealth worth in the United States by education levels and family structure. So I was looking at here controlling for education and other things, the typical characteristics, race, age, etc. What you have is less than high school, some college, and college. The blue is the married couple. The purple are single parents, and the yellow are cohabiting. Typically, the fight is between those two, right? The last ones is the last position is typically between the single and the cohabiting, with one exception, and that is Guatemala, and I will explain why in a minute. But clearly, this simple graph shows you that even education cannot make up for the difference. Net wealth by family structure. This is Canada, and what I looked at here was wealth and housing. And why did I do that? Because the supreme crisis, right? But not only for that, because really housing is an important factor, has been, I should say, has been is a better description, an important factor of social mobility, right? Why is it, I always say, that the same Guatemalan, right, that is in poverty striking level in his country, moved to the United States, and within 3 generations or 2 generations is middle America. Even the illegals own a house, right? And that is the collateral that they need to invest, to educate their children, etc. This is America, the story of America, and something that has been changing, and that, I would argue, is what we have seen in the subprime crisis. But what we have here, then I measure wealth and I measure housing. Again, causality holds. Family structure is the single most significant variable across the countries in determining wealth of when you look at the different family characteristics. Marriage, the reduction from being married to single parents is 200%, and this is a social market economy, right? So technically, we shouldn't see this. 263% of the reduction of housing, or the value of housing, among single parents versus married couples, cohabiting being second last as opposed to the United States, that typically is the last one. Chile, you get the concept, more of the same. Here we have wealth structure, a married, single mother cohabiting. And one more time, clearly, the family structure is important for wealth, and remember, that is important for investment. Now here we have Guatemala. Guatemala, the first thing I want to show you here is these are percentages of households with savings and home ownership in Guatemala. And once again, what you see is single mothers, separated, divorced, widows, married. And what you see clearly is that the wealth and the savings, the ownership, home ownership, stays with a married couple. Why is this not working? Okay. I wanted to bring up also the issues of level of education, because remember I told you in Guatemala, 60% of the average level of education is 3rd grade. I'm being generous, as I said. Clearly, whether you are LAD, there stands for Ladino, so whites, and the other ones are indigenous. Clearly, whether you're married, whether you're Ladino or indigenous, and the percentage of households with higher education are found among married couples. And if I were to, I couldn't show you all the information I have, but if you look at, for example, attendance, here I put for Guatemala, but I didn't show you for the other countries. Again, clearly is connected to family structure, and this is an important problem for education. Now, I was telling you about the remittances, and the reason why I put a question mark on the remittances is I think that after we saw the failure, especially in Latin America, but it's true for Asia too, we see the failure of investment or lack of investment in Latin America and the capital flight that generated, etc. I think that we macroeconomists saw remittances as a way of making up for that. Finally, the people were investing on their own countries. But is that necessarily a good thing? And at least at the micro level, I have to say, I'm not sure I can stand by it. Guatemala is a country that I know particularly well. I have carried several studies there. I have combed that country. I've seen every corner of it. I think I know the country. What I've seen there, first of all, what we find in our studies is the highest probability of attending great schools in married households. Typically, the one who leave the country is the men. I've seen towns full, a whole town where there's no men left. And I've seen here affirmation. In other countries, you find it too. In fact, you do. have the lowest probability of attending high school in non-married households when there is a single mother that receive remittances. Which is very interesting because then you have all the guns, right? I mean, the maras, as they call it in Guatemala. What happens? You have teenagers with no father, mother working, and money. The worst recipe you can expect, right? And then if women is the head of the household and works, the probability decreases by 66% of the parents attending education. So what we see is that remittances, yeah, it might look very nice in the balance of payments and great when you compare to the GDP and you think on the amount of reserves you need perhaps to sustain your exchange rate or your expenditures or monetarization of the economy, depending what you're trying to do. But what we are seeing institutionally is not great. Mm-hmm. And so if we think that we need institutions, this is an important component of sustainable economic growth, then I think we need to begin to rethink what is happening with the remittances. And by the way, these comments can be applied to Mexico too. So what could we do, right? Well, I would argue that healthy families is an important component of sustainable economic growth. When we think in long term, we need to think on institutions. And the data seems to suggest that family is a very important institution within the process of economic growth. How could we go about it? Well, legislation that supports healthy marriages and stable families as opposed to undermining it. And I know this might be popular or not less popular, but when we think and develop countries that need migrants, they need them. Because if they don't have them, they don't have labor force. What type of policies do you implement that will avoid the breakdowns of the families? Just to give an example, close to home besides. Protection of families as a means of eradication of poverty and specifically feminization of poverty. If we want to talk about feminization of poverty, we cannot ignore the family structure, whether we like it or not. Subsidies and penalties for children. Programs directed toward fostering functional societies and markets, irradiating corruption, parental leaving programs. I mean, all these things that they're not new, but we know that can be useful. Enhance parental rights to educate their children. And here, one thing that I want to bring up, I couldn't show you everything, but I sometimes do research on odd things. And I decided to look at how family dinners, something as basic as family dinners, affected human capital. And I look at this data that actually was raw data from Columbia University. They did a series of studies on this. And guess what I find? Family dinners, nothing sophisticated, right? Family dinners, once a week. So the data show you if they did it 1 to 2 times or 1 to 5 times, right? And we're talking about reductions of drug use of 95%. We are talking about improvements of grade of 2 points. We are talking about significant changes, relationship with the parents, stabilities of families. I mean, it's unbelievable. As simple as family dinners. I mean, this is pretty basic, right? But the point I'm trying to say here is when we think about macro policies, we can think, well, what is the work schedule? How many hours? What is the flexibility of the hours? All these things the data seems to suggest that if we are serious about sustainable economic growth, we need to be looking at these elements. Transfer governments aid through different voucher systems of target resources. One thing that really surprised me, and I found this in the Philippines, I found this in Chile, I found this in Guatemala as a very poor country, is that involving the parents more and more in the education system. And sometimes these parents do not know how to read or write, how to add or subtract. But the improvement of the education of those schools where parents were involved was extremely high. And even in the administration, right, they could fire or hire the teachers, etc. And it seems to be effective. And by the way, the United States is not an exception. We see these charter schools multiplying, right, quite a bit across the United States. Enhance parents' own rights to educate their children, allow parents to engage in municipal school management, that's what I was specifically referring to. Competitive funds, could we get the market more engaged in trying to get the private sector to get involved in civic education, sexual education, pre-marriage orientations, instead of just government-run programs that doesn't seem to be too effective. So with this, I want to finish, and I will be open to any questions you want or discussion. What my data indicates, or my studies indicates, and again, data across science is pretty consistent on this, is that the family is necessary. It's a necessary good. It's not a luxury. It's not a luxury good. It's a necessary good for economic development, and thus poverty eradication. And therefore, it should be promoted, protected, right? If we want poverty and development, poverty will be eliminated and development take place. Family structure is relevant for wealth, and therefore for investment as well as human, social, and moral capital generation. Many years ago when I used to talk about moral capital, everybody told me, where did you tell me that you were from, And the reason why I laugh, because once Enron happened, I never again was bothered, and now I have the subprime crisis to show you. Anyway, the impact of children on family wealth and well-being is best within marriage. Evidence seems to hold across countries, independently of what is the economic system that the country has or even economic conditions. And then I didn't show you, but I wanted to bring it up because it is an important factor for discussion. And that is, I find in my studies that the life cycle theory of savings, Podigliani's theory of savings, is supported by empirical evidence, which that tells us something about the relevance of aging population, both in developed countries and developing countries where, I couldn't show you all the data I have, but in developing countries that aging population is happening at an accelerated level, and that puts us even in a more strained financial condition. Okay, thank you very much. Anyway, any questions? No questions? Yes?
I know the answer to this question, but I just want to point it out. What about families that are abusive? Do the same things apply?
Well, I said for families that are stable, right? Mother, father in a stable relationship. I think that if you have a dysfunctional family, it's a dysfunctional family. And therefore problems have to apply. My data doesn't tell me if you have been abused or not. I'm using survey data across countries, so that information, I don't have it. But what do we know, though, is that the psychological studies are plentiful on this area, right? And there, what you have is the following. It depends the degree of abuse, what is better. Because what we know is that abandonment, as the psychologists speak about, right, or rejection, is a very serious, has a very negative effect in the normal development of a person, and independently of the age, by the way. So that's what the data shows, right? So, but if anything, though, what I would say, that cost me money. Again, I didn't show you that data either, but I have done some studies of what the cost of the breakdown of the family is, right? Because that costs us money. Finances, we are bodies, so we need things. In the United States, roughly speaking, $1.3 trillion. Of that, about 27%, 28% is Social Security, that number that I just quoting. That includes elderly who have nobody to claim them, and that I call it breakdown of the family, because typically you should have a son, a daughter, a husband, somebody around, right? So if you're alone and nobody can claim you, there's something strange with the picture. So what I would say that what the data would suggest to this is that what you try to do is, first, you want prevention. If we do so much prevention, we need to do prevention about these issues. And number two, you want to try to not break the family because of that, but try to heal it if it's possible. But it's a problem. It definitely is, yes.
Family disintegration seems to be, to me at least, mainly an issue that's outside of economics. I mean, that increasing disintegration of the family and so forth. At least I would argue.
Wow, the data shows me that it has a big consequences.
What I'm saying is that the reason families are disintegrating, there are other reasons they're not economic. But,
No, that's true.
But I agree with you that healthy families are in fact good for economics. So what I'm trying to say is, or what my question I guess is, what kind of legislation, what kind of policies would re-strengthen families, whether that be in the developing world or in the first world?
Well, let me say this. I remember a couple of years ago when England passed a law that it was basically anybody who wanted to get married needed to have a preparation by law, right? And everybody was in uproar until they showed the numbers. And then they said, oh, we better do, because you know what, we cannot maintain this. So, I mean, this is an example. I think that the question for me is like, what type of policies, and this is what I said before, I'm not a good friend of government does it all. I think the government needs to invest on it and count on civil society to carry out some of these functions. So when you ask me what type of policy, I think that we need to be seriously looking at investment on that front. I mean, we can invest on Haiti and education as much as we want, but if we don't pay attention to the fact of the structure of the family, strengthen that civil society, you will not have success in education. So what I'm saying, I guess my message here is, when you think about policies, there have to be policies that have to think. You need to think, what's the impact on the family structure in here? And yes, we need to do a lot of investment on reinforcing families, because there are problems. There are many problems, and only more each time. And anyway, a study just came out that shows that 52% of the youth has problems of relations in this country. Relational problems. Well, you tell me, if we have 52% of youth with relational problems, you tell me how we're going to pull a marriage forward. I mean, yes?
I know you mentioned it a couple times that correlation does not necessarily mean causation.
Yes.
Could it also be a fact that people who are able to maintain healthy families are going to be more stable and therefore more inclined to be the higher wage earners, more housed?
No, so you're telling me it's a Darwinian self-selection problem.
Yeah.
Okay. No, good question, valid question. I have tried to control for those things. And even then, I find the same data. Now, that being said, I think there must be some of that. And that's why I'm saying we need to invest on families, because, you know, at some point we have to stop the bias cycle. I will also say that I think what is going on here is when you are married, you think long term, and so you maximize long term. And it's true for business, it's true for marriage, right? So when you are married, you will think long term, you invest long term. When you are not, you don't, right? Cohabiting, etc. Single parents. But yes, and my answer to you is yes, but I think that only reinforces my point. Yes.
Early on, when you referred to institutions, are you talking about governmental or NGOs?
I talk about all levels. What I mean with institutions, I'm taking more of a broader econ analysis of institutions. So I'm talking from rule of law to transparency to governmental functioning institution. I'm talking about civil society. It's all different levels of institutions, because what the data shows is we need all different levels of institutions.
The second part of that,
yes,
you referenced inefficient policies, and you just referenced policies again.
Yes.
Are there any statistics that illustrate or support or don't support the effect of governments on NGOs that have policies that are, I mean, when NGOs go into a country, they have specific purposes to go in there. Governments don't necessarily have specific purposes. Are there any statistics that support the effect of governments that have policies that are not efficient and don't allow NGOs to do their jobs in countries?
Okay, there is evidence, for example, on issues of democratization, that there are plenty of studies coming from public policy, public choice, all these people, that shows you that, for example, the process of democratization facilitates and helps accountability and stability. So those type of, at that level, yes, I can tell you that there is data of that. There's also data that shows, for example, the whole work of, and I've done studies on this, the impact of NGOs through microcredit, for example. And how,
you referenced in there, and I was going to bring up microcredit.
yes.
Are usually administered through women.
Well, you know, on that one, I would say used to be that microcredit was women, and so the simple reason is that men drank the money, the women invested, and so but that has changed. In the past 80 years or so, there's quite a bit of new modeling, including the United States, how we invest. And the reason for that in microcredit is because one thing that the studies have shown is that if you go for couples as opposed to just only the women, the time that it takes that family to get out of misery, or the poor of the poor, as we call it in economics, World Bank data classification, is much faster. Because what you see
with married couples.
With married couples, because what you see is the men invest in the business and the women starts educating the girls, or typically doesn't happen. So that is changing. But you are right that at the beginning, majority of the micro for many years, not only the beginning, it could focus on women. You're absolutely right on that.
10 years ago, I was in India and Nepal,
That's right.
and dealing with microcredits,
Yes.
and it was almost.
Yes. Well, Grameen tends to go that way, but it's yeah. But it's, I would say, for what the studies show and what I've seen. I mean, I studied several of them too. And that trend is moving, and I have to do it for the government, remember? And we decided, the USAID today funds quite a bit of married couple focus because of the data shown. But I think a microcredit is an example where you look at, that's not going to solve the problem of an economy. But what you're doing is solving problems of miseries and moving forward up, and that helps. Yes?
You mentioned about the importance of legislation for maintaining, as a key to maintaining the structure and well-being of the family. Do you have any idea of what could be the most important legislation for that? Would it be laws as for higher punishment for domestic abuse, or would it be about making divorces easier for families and stuff like that?
Well, making divorce easier for families will break my economy, according with my data. I mean, because the wealth lost is huge. I would say that prevention, things that leads to the strengthening of families is the solution, right? But again, I'm not saying that there's no space for breakdown of families. Sometimes there is, because the way it works, it just cannot be sustained, right? And it's more harmful to people, etc. But I think that it's important that we talk about prevention when we think in terms of family, and we don't. We instead give you all type of money. Pardon me?
Do you know, is there anything of the legal system that could do this? Sort of the importance of specific legislation?
Well, HHS implemented quite a few programs on this front. And the data shows, now that we have enough years, that have been very successful in the area of prevention, in the area of pre-marriage preparations, psychological treatments, counseling, and all this stuff. And for that, they use quite a bit of civil society, right? It was not government provision necessarily. It was a combination of things. And that's another thing. What is the best substitute? I mean, again, I'm not a sociologist. I haven't done these studies directly, but what sociology literature shows you is that the closer you get to the family unit, the better you are. And that's why I insist in civil society. Because your neighborhood will do better than the government somewhere, in the municipality. So that's what the type of data shows you, is that the closer you are to your network, the better is the solution. Yes?
I don't want you to misunderstand my question and think that I'm arguing against your whole point.
Oh, you might. You wouldn't be the first one.
This is kind of general, but what about the fact that, I don't know, starting 100 years ago or something, the turn of the 20th century, government has become increasingly involved, and yet, family structures have broken down horribly. I'm talking about just in America. Now, I'm not saying that this could be because the government is passing legislation that hurts families, and you're arguing that we need legislation that benefits families. So, it could be either one, but what about just that government legislation and how involved they have become at even the smallest structure, which would be the family, is hurting families so much because, like you said, a neighborhood does better because they know themselves, they know what works, whereas the government farm.
Well, let me put it this way. I think that I know what you're getting. By no means I'm arguing here that the government is the solution. I mean, look at the Swedish case, has been a disaster, right? So by no means, that's what I'm saying. But I'm talking about policy here, and policy means government, right? So the question is, and that's why I talked about competitive grants, so these type of things, is when the government gets involved doesn't mean, in what my presentation, that the government has to do it. You can delegate, right? I mean, so when we think about policies, I go back, I think what we don't think about is what is the impact on marriage. I mean, think about, well, you're too young, so you maybe don't remember, but in the 80s, right, when the famous study came out from the University of Chicago on social welfare dependency, we were all pulling our hair, right? Well, what is this? Terrible, right? Women, it was better for them not to get married, to produce children, because they would get a higher income if they worked, right? Or you can think of the marriage tax penalty. So these are the type of things that I'm thinking. That's what cannot happen, because the cost is simply too high and hampers sustainable economic growth. That's the argument here, I think. That's what I'm trying. Did I answer your question?
I think so, yeah.
Yes.
Jumping way to a whole different part of your lecture.
Yeah.
Your statistics on malaria were really interesting. I especially happened to just be discussing it with students in a research writing course I'm teaching.
Yeah.
Given what you're just saying, you're talking about the very, very efficient, cost-efficient, the great cost efficiency of using pills and so forth. I know WHO has actually been trying to move in favor of reversing the DDT ban based on that. What do you think? Do you think we don't need to go there? It sounded like maybe we didn't, which was interesting to me.
Yeah. I think the World Health Organization is moving in the right direction on that one. At least it's my take for what I've seen in Sub-Saharan Africa. So yeah. Yes.
So for the children and adults that already come from these broken families, have you come across any policies that increases the rates of, education or income or, etc.?
Well, the thing is, again, a lot. It's a difficult answer. Okay. What we know is that income or education will not solve the problem. It might facilitate solutions, but doesn't solve the problem. Okay, so, and this is why, I only show you here the impact of wealth on education, but take anything you want, any of the typical characteristics of families. Nothing is as significant as family structure.
Well, no, what I'm saying is, if a person already belongs to a broken family, are there policies that could increase their well-being, given that they are from a broken family?
Again, what the data shows is the closer to home, the merrier. So I think that, once again, I'm all for competitive grants. Get civil society involved at all different levels to try to solve those problems instead of, massive, counseling programs or whatever. Try to get local, because that's what the data shows. The closer to home, and when I say closer to home, I mean networks, right? The more effective the solutions are. But there is somebody who has already a problem, right? It starts with a handicap situation that needs to be helped.
The reason why I'm asking is I'm thinking in terms of breaking the cycle.
That's right.
broken families.
But then you need treatment, and that's no, really, you need to develop skills. Look, it's like you have a bad back, you need to learn how to operate with your bad back. Well, the same goes for this other type, but this is what the data shows you, right? I mean, you might have a specific type of attitude, react to specific things, relational problems. Trust is a big one on these cases because you've been abandoned or whatever. So that is very difficult to solve and creates all type of problems. That's what the data shows, right? And empirical studies, psychology. A lot comes from psychology on this one. And therefore, you need to learn to teach that person how to operate with that. And by the way, this is an important part of prevention when you get married. So, I mean, these type of things, I mean, they are. The answer is the psychology literature has plenty on this front. And sociology also has plenty on this front. People who does counseling type of things, critical situation has plenty on that. So the solutions are there. I mean, it's not to be invented. But what I would say the principle is that the closer the network, the more effective it is. I mean, faith-based initiatives is another one that it has been shown to be effective.
One more question.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, you mentioned the disaster of the Swedish case earlier. I'm thinking specifically of governments, primarily in Europe, that offer incentives for subsidies for children. And one of the things that I've observed in one of those countries is, the longer time that government is offering incentives for children, the more that it may not necessarily be causative, but over time, that's shifted the number of people having children that are married to be less and less and less. So, we've seen, the more incentives, the more government programs there are to promote children, but that are indiscriminate of marriage, the more it's kind of shifted towards having more children than not from marriage. But how does the government, how can the government encourage growth of the population through, children organically within the country rather than people coming in as immigrants without discriminating among families versus unmarried individuals having children? Without playing favorites, it's like, it's like...
For me, that's an interesting question because it brings to me a more fundamental question. I always get in these arguments because I have heard that argument, that question have been given to me before because of studies I've done too on this area. And that is, why should the government get involved to begin with? Excuse me. Why should the government get involved to begin with, right? And goes back to your question, right? And the answer is because there are children involved, and this is the future, right? This is the future of my society. Then it makes sense for me to be discriminatory, in fact, because what the data shows me is that the best is that within marriage. So why should I give facility to everybody? I mean, I think there is an argument of simple maximization conditions here, social welfare maximization, that favors a government to give benefits discriminatory in your terms, if that is discrimination. Any more questions?
If we have this time, I know you said one last question, but I'm interested in your thoughts on child labor laws, and do you think that actually helps or hurts families?
That's another very difficult question because child labor. In principle, I know I'm going to scandalize half of the room, but anyway, I know we think child discrimination in the United States, child labor in the United States, and we say bad, 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 bad. Well, I've been in countries and seen programs that thank God that child is working because the whole family will be starving. So the question becomes, how does that child work? I think that the question is not whether we should have child labor or not. The question is under which conditions and how does that child work? Because if it is, I've seen programs where the child is educated, otherwise he would not get education, who does not work under conditions, hiding and under literally on the floor, flying down, ruin lungs, ruin back, ruin everything because nobody else can get in there for the machines, for the textile machines. So my take on that one is you cannot do blankets here. It has to be one-on-one, case on cases, and even within a country over the years, things can change. Because as the country becomes more developed and families less dependent and so forth, then it might not be necessary. But my take on that one is careful. I don't say no child labor at all. I mean, depending on the labor, I repeat, right? If I'm going to have prostitution, it will be another story. Yeah.
Ma'am, divorce and socioeconomic indicators. So I mean, countries like, I mean, in Scandinavia and in Northern America, you have very high divorce rates, and in countries like in South Asia, you have very low divorce rates. So, is there any correlation between divorce and happiness in some ways, or?
I have a paper on that one. Anyway, this is an because it was an interesting. You know why? I have to tell you what. I knew from the data that divorce was worse than the Great Depression. So from a wealth point of view, bad news. And in the economic literature justify it by saying that's a shadow price, right? I want to be happier, and so I get divorced, so I'm happier. And that's my shadow price, as we call it. But you see, the data shows now that maybe that shadow price is really a shadow cost, because depression comes across, the problems of attachment, the problem of, I mean, all type of problems that come as a consequence of divorce. So maybe the shadow price, the happiness that we're talking about, maybe it's not such, right? And anyway, so that's my answer to you, is that maybe the shadow price is not there as clear. Okay. Any more questions? Yes.
Sorry, really quickly. In one of your slides, you mentioned the feminization of poverty, and I was just wondering if you could maybe define that, and what are the
percentage of women? What happens with women? Because one of the many arguments that you hear, and what my background on that point is the UN policies. I mean, for many years I work on these issues. The typical argument they give you why, is empowerment of women, because family is a hostile place for the women, right? Because imagine you have children, you have a husband; these are all bad things, right? So we need to empower women and get rid of the family. And so what is very interesting is that when you look from a wealth point of view, a poverty point of view, what I find is, in fact, family structure is an important driver for the feminization of women. In other words, single mothers, cohabiting women typically suffer much more poverty than the marriage structure, which seems to me that if we are going to talk about povertization of women, we need to talk about family structure. And maybe if we want to empower women, maybe this is not the path, right? Because typically they end up worse off. And in a divorce, normally the one who loses the most is women, because they stay with the children, etc. I mean, often they have no work, etc. So, any more questions? Okay, thank you very much.